The concrete mixer's engine roared to life at exactly 6:47 a.m., drowning out the sound of 8-year-old Emma Chen's bare feet slapping against the cracked pavement as she ran toward the construction fence. Her small fists clutched a wrinkled piece of paper covered in crayon drawings, and her dark hair flew behind her like a banner of desperation. The yellow hard hats turning in her direction belonged to men who had seen plenty of protests before, but none quite like this. Standing barely 3 feet tall in her faded unicorn pajamas, Emma pressed her drawing against the chain-link fence and shouted over the machinery with a voice that somehow carried more weight than all the bulldozers combined. What she didn't know was that the man stepping out of the black Mercedes across the street, adjusting his expensive suit jacket as he surveyed the demolition site, was the very person who held the power to save or destroy everything she loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Avenue, painting the row of aging brownstones in shades of amber and gold that made them look almost magical, despite their peeling paint and sagging stoops. Emma Chen had lived in number 47 her entire 8 years, and every crack in the sidewalk told a story she knew by heart. The building might have been scheduled for demolition, but to her it was a castle filled with treasures no adult seemed capable of seeing. She pressed her face against the cool chain-link fence that had appeared overnight like a metallic scar across her world. The construction workers moved with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment from massive trucks that seemed to swallow the narrow street. Their voices carried instructions about load-bearing walls and structural integrity, words that meant nothing to a child whose entire vocabulary for her home consisted of words like cozy and safe and forever. The drawing in her hands had been created the night before, when sleep refused to come. While her grandmother Mei Lin dozed in the recliner by the window, Emma had spread her art supplies across the kitchen table and poured her heart onto paper. The house she'd drawn looked nothing like the weathered building behind her. In her 8-year-old imagination, number 47 stood tall and proud, surrounded by blooming flowers and smiling stick figures that represented every neighbor who had ever brought them soup when they were sick or helped carry groceries up the steep stairs. At the top of the drawing, in carefully formed block letters that had taken her nearly 20 minutes to perfect, she had written, "Please don't take our home away." Below that, in smaller script that wobbled with emotion, "We love it here, and it loves us back." The foreman approached the fence with the weary expression of a man who had dealt with his share of last-minute protests. His name was Rodriguez, and his weathered face suggested decades of construction sites and difficult conversations. He glanced at Emma's drawing with the kind of polite attention adults reserved for children's artwork, then looked beyond her to see if any parents were lurking nearby. "Sweetheart, you need to step back from the fence," he said, his voice not unkind but firm with authority. "This is a construction zone now. It's not safe for little girls." Emma's grip tightened on her drawing. "But this is my house," she said, pointing to the building behind him. "I live right there, in the window with the purple curtains. That's my room where I keep my books, and my stuffed elephant, and the nightlight my mom gave me before she went to heaven." Rodriguez paused, his clipboard suddenly feeling heavier in his hands. He had read the relocation notices, knew that most of the residents had already moved out with the assistance of city housing programs. A few holdouts remained, mostly elderly tenants with nowhere else to go, but he hadn't expected to find a child still living in the condemned building. "Where's your family, honey?" he asked, crouching down to meet her eyes through the fence links. "Grandma Malin is inside making breakfast," Emma replied. "She's 92, and her legs don't work so good anymore. But she makes the best congee in the whole world. She says we can't leave because this is where Grandpa's spirit lives, in the walls he painted and the garden he planted in the backyard." The foreman glanced toward the building, noting the purple curtains Emma had mentioned and the small face of an elderly woman peering out from behind them. His radio crackled with instructions from the site supervisor, but he found himself unable to look away from the child's drawing. In all his years of demolition work, he had torn down hundreds of buildings, each one somebody's former home, but something about the way Emma had drawn her house made it look less like a structure and more like a living thing with windows for eyes and a door that curved upward like a smile. "Can I see your drawing?" he asked, extending his hand through a gap in the fence. Emma hesitated for a moment, then carefully passed the paper through the chain links. Rodriguez unfolded it completely, taking in every detail. The flowers Emma had drawn around the base of the building were bright purple and yellow, colors that seemed to leap off the page. The stick figures held hands in a circle around the house, and each one wore a smile that took up half their round faces. In the corner of the paper, she had drawn a much smaller house with an X through it, labeled "The New Place, Too Small and Sad." "This is really good artwork," Rodriguez said, and he meant it. "You're a talented artist." "My teacher says I have an imagination bigger than the whole sky," Emma replied, a note of pride creeping into her voice despite her tears. "But I don't want to imagine living somewhere else. I want to keep living here with Grandma Maylin and all our neighbors who are like family." Rodriguez folded the drawing carefully and handed it back through the fence. "I'm going to need to make some phone calls," he said. "Can you go inside and stay with your grandmother while I figure some things out?" Emma nodded, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her pajamas. As she turned to walk back toward the building, Rodriguez pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. The call connected after 2 rings. "Mr. Harrison, it's Rodriguez from the Riverside site. We've got a situation here that I think you need to see for yourself." Across the street, Marcus Harrison ended the call and slipped his phone back into the inner pocket of his Italian wool suit. At 38, he had built Pinnacle Development from a small construction company into one of the city's most successful real estate firms. The Riverside project represented his largest undertaking yet, a mixed-use development that would transform 6 blocks of aging housing into luxury condominiums and retail space. The profit margins were substantial, the city permits had been secured after months of negotiations, and the demolition was scheduled to begin within the hour. He had driven to the site that morning to personally oversee the first phase of demolition, a habit he had maintained since the early days of his business. There was something about watching the old make way for the new that satisfied him on a level he rarely examined too closely. Progress required sacrifice, and sacrifice required someone willing to make the difficult decisions others avoided. Marcus had learned this lesson early. His own childhood had been spent in a series of cramped apartments and temporary housing situations after his father abandoned the family when Marcus was 12. His mother, Sarah, had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, but poverty had been a constant companion that taught him to view sentiment as a luxury he couldn't afford. By the time he graduated high school, he had already decided that financial security would be his primary goal, and that goal had served him well in the decades that followed. The Riverside demolition was supposed to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Routine. The residents had been given 18 months' notice, generous relocation assistance had been provided, and the few remaining holdouts would be handled by the city's social services department. Marcus had reviewed the files personally and confirmed that proper procedures had been followed. The buildings were old, some dating back to the 1920s, and bringing them up to current code would cost more than their market value. Demolition was not just profitable, it was practical. But as he walked toward the construction fence, Marcus found his attention drawn not to the heavy machinery or the efficiency of his crew, but to the small figure in unicorn pajamas who was now sitting on the front steps of Building 47. The child appeared to be talking to someone inside, her voice carrying across the street in fragments that suggested she was explaining something important to a person who couldn't see what was happening outside. Rodriguez met him at the gate, his expression troubled in a way that Marcus had rarely seen from his veteran foreman. In 15 years of working together, Rodriguez had handled protesters, permit delays, and unexpected structural problems with calm professionalism. Whatever had prompted his phone call was something outside the normal scope of construction complications. "Show me what's going on," Marcus said, accepting the hard hat Rodriguez offered him. They walked together toward Building 47, passing equipment that sat idle while the crew waited for instructions. Marcus noted the efficiency of the staging area, the proper safety protocols being followed, and the careful coordination that would allow the demolition to proceed on schedule once any obstacles were cleared. Everything appeared to be in order, except for the presence of the child, who looked up as they approached with eyes that held more gravity than seemed possible for someone so young. "This is Emma," Rodriguez said. "She lives in the building with her grandmother. She wanted to show you something." Emma stood up from the steps, her drawing clutched against her chest like a shield. She studied Marcus with the kind of directness that adults often found unsettling in children, as if she were looking past his expensive clothing and confident posture to something deeper underneath. "Are you the boss man?" she asked. "The one who decides if our house gets knocked down?" Marcus nodded, unsure why he felt compelled to crouch down to her level. "I'm Marcus Harrison. This is my project." Emma unfolded her drawing and held it out to him. "I made this for you," she said. "It's a picture of why our house should stay right where it is." Marcus accepted the drawing, expecting to give it the kind of cursory glance that politeness required before explaining the realities of development schedules and construction timelines. Instead, he found himself studying the details with growing fascination. The house Emma had drawn bore little resemblance to the aging building behind her, yet somehow it captured something essential about the place that architectural surveys and structural reports had missed entirely. The stick figures surrounding the house were labeled with names and small details that suggested Emma knew each of her neighbors personally. Mrs. Patterson from apartment 2B was drawn with a walker and a cat. Mr. Delacroix from the ground floor held what appeared to be a trumpet, and his stick figure mouth was open as if caught mid-song. The elderly woman, labeled Grandma Maylin, stood in a window surrounded by plants, her arms outstretched as if welcoming the world into her home. At the bottom of the page, Emma had drawn a garden filled with vegetables and flowers. Tiny labels identified tomatoes, roses, and what appeared to be herbs growing in neat rows. Above the garden she had written in careful letters, "Grandpa planted this before he went to heaven. Grandma says his love still grows here." Marcus turned the paper over and found more drawings on the back. These showed the interior of the building as Emma experienced it, a kitchen filled with the warm glow of morning light, a living room where people gathered to share meals, bedrooms that looked cozy rather than cramped. At the center of these domestic scenes, Emma had drawn herself and her grandmother holding hands, both figures radiating the kind of contentment that money couldn't purchase. "This is very detailed," Marcus said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You must love living here." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "It's the best house in the whole world. Grandma Maylin has lived here for 40 years, ever since she and Grandpa came from Taiwan. She knows everyone on the street, and everyone knows her. When people are sick, she makes them soup. When they're sad, she listens to their problems. When they're happy, she celebrates with them." She pointed to the building behind Marcus, her small finger tracing the line of windows as if each one told a story. "Mrs. Patterson in 2B used to be a dance teacher, and sometimes she still shows me ballet moves in the hallway. Mr. Delacroix plays jazz music every evening at 6 o'clock, and all the neighbors come out to listen. The Ramirez family in 3A has twin babies who cry sometimes, but Grandma says that's just the sound of new life finding its voice." Marcus found himself looking at the building with fresh eyes, noting details he had missed during his previous site visits. The front steps were worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, creating natural grooves where countless residents had sat to watch the street. The windows, while old, were clean, and many were decorated with curtains or plants that suggested care and attention. The small front garden that Emma had drawn was real, he realized, though currently dormant in the late autumn weather. "Where will you go when the building comes down?" he asked, though he immediately regretted the assumption implicit in his question. Emma's face fell, and she clutched the drawing more tightly. "The city people found us a new apartment in a big building across town. It's just one room for me and Grandma, and there's no garden and no neighbors we know. Grandma cried when they showed it to us because she said it felt like a box where people wait to die." She looked up at Marcus with eyes that held a desperation beyond her years. "But we don't want to wait to die. We want to keep living here, in the place where we belong. Can't your new buildings go somewhere else? Somewhere where nobody is already happy?" The question hung in the air between them, simple in its phrasing but complex in its implications. Marcus had built his career on identifying undervalued properties and maximizing their development potential. The Riverside block had been chosen precisely because it offered the optimal combination of location, price point, and minimal political resistance. The residents were primarily elderly, low income, or both, which meant their objections carried little weight in city planning meetings, where profit margins and tax revenue took precedence over sentiment. But as he looked at Emma's drawing again, Marcus found himself remembering his own childhood in a way he had spent decades avoiding. He had been about Emma's age when his family was evicted from their apartment on Maple Street, not because of demolition, but because his mother couldn't afford the rent increase that came with neighborhood gentrification. He remembered packing his belongings into garbage bags and leaving behind the only bedroom he had ever known, the one where his mother had read him stories and helped him with homework at a desk his father had built before everything fell apart. The memory carried a physical weight that surprised him. He had trained himself to think of that eviction as a motivating factor, proof that financial security was worth pursuing at any cost. But standing in front of Emma, he felt the old ache of displacement, the particular sadness that comes from being forced to leave a place where you belong. Rodriguez cleared his throat, drawing Marcus back to the present moment. "The crew is waiting for instructions," he said quietly. "We can work around the occupied building for now, but the demolition schedule assumes we start with the corner units." Marcus nodded absently, still studying Emma's drawing. "Give me an hour," he said. "Tell the crew to take a break while I make some calls." Emma's face brightened with hope. "Does that mean you might save our house?" Marcus looked down at her, struck by the trust in her expression despite having just met him. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I promise to think very carefully about your drawing." As he walked back toward his car, Marcus felt the weight of his phone in his pocket and the list of calls he needed to make. The project investors would need explanations, the construction timeline would require adjustments, and the city planning office would want assurances that delays wouldn't affect other approved developments. Each conversation would be a test of his commitment to a decision he hadn't yet made. But first, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't called in months, waiting through several rings until a familiar voice answered. "Mom, it's Marcus. I know it's been a while, but I have a question about something that happened when I was a kid." The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and covered ground that Marcus had avoided exploring for most of his adult life. His mother's voice carried the same warmth he remembered from childhood, along with a sadness he was only now mature enough to recognize. She told him about the months of sleepless nights before their eviction, the way she had tried to shield him from her panic about finding a new place to live. She described the afternoon she had packed his books and toys, wondering how to explain that their small apartment had been sold to developers who planned to build something bigger and more expensive in its place. "You drew me a picture that day," she said, her voice growing soft with memory. "It was a house with all of us inside, safe and happy. You wrote, 'Don't worry, Mama,' at the bottom. I kept that drawing for years, until it fell apart from being folded and unfolded so many times." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the boy he had been before disappointment taught him to protect his heart with pragmatism. "What happened to that kid who drew pictures?" he asked. "He grew up," his mother replied. "But I always hoped he was still in there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to remember what home really means." After ending the call, Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, watching Emma through the windshield as she tended to the small garden behind her building. She had changed out of her pajamas into jeans and a bright yellow jacket, and she moved among the dormant plants with the kind of careful attention that suggested genuine responsibility rather than play. Her grandmother appeared at the back door, leaning heavily on a walker but smiling as she watched Emma work. The scene reminded Marcus of something he couldn't quite place until the memory surfaced with startling clarity. His own grandmother, his father's mother, had kept a small garden behind her house in Queens. She had died when Marcus was 10, but he remembered the summer afternoons he had spent helping her water tomatoes and pull weeds from around the marigolds she planted to keep pests away. The garden had been tiny, just a narrow strip of soil between her house and the alley, but she had tended it with the kind of devotion that made it seem like the most important place in the world. After his grandmother's death, the house had been sold and converted into a convenience store. The garden had been paved over for additional parking, and Marcus had never thought to mourn its loss until this moment. Now, watching Emma care for plants that would be destroyed within hours if demolition proceeded as scheduled, he felt a grief that seemed disproportionate to the situation but impossible to ignore. His phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. Crew asking about lunch break timing. Need guidance on afternoon schedule. Marcus typed back, extend lunch break to 2 hours. No demolition until further notice. Then he got out of his car and walked back toward Building 47, where Emma was now sitting on the back steps with her grandmother. The elderly woman looked up as he approached, her weathered face carrying the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of facing difficulties with grace. "You must be the man who wants to tear down our home," she said in accented English, her voice carrying no anger, just a weary acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. Marcus removed his hard hat as he approached, a gesture of respect he hadn't planned but that felt necessary. "I'm Marcus Harrison. And you're Mei Lin?" The elderly woman nodded. Mei Lin Chen. Emma's grandmother and the guardian of too many memories to count. "Grandma, I showed him my picture," Emma interjected, bouncing slightly on the steps. He said he would think very carefully about it. Mei Lin studied Marcus with eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "Thinking carefully is good," she said. "But thinking with the heart is better than thinking with only the mind. Would you mind if I asked you some questions about this place?" Marcus said, settling onto the step beside them despite his expensive suit. "Emma's drawing made me curious about what I might be missing." Mei Lin smiled, the expression transforming her face from weary to radiant. "Questions are always welcome. Come, let me show you what 40 years looks like when it's lived with love." What followed was a tour, unlike any Marcus had ever experienced. Mei Lin moved slowly, but with purpose, guiding him through the building while Emma provided commentary that painted each space with stories and memories. They visited Mrs. Patterson's apartment, where the elderly former dance teacher showed Marcus photographs of the students she had taught in the building's community room for decades. Her walls were covered with recital programs and thank-you notes from children who had grown up to become teachers and performers themselves. In the basement, Mr. Delacroix had created a makeshift music studio where he gave free trumpet lessons to neighborhood children. His collection of instruments, accumulated over a lifetime of playing in jazz clubs and marching bands, filled shelves that ran from floor to ceiling. The concrete walls were decorated with posters from concerts he had played, and photographs of students who had gone on to join school bands and community orchestras. The Ramirez family welcomed them into an apartment that seemed far larger than its actual square footage, thanks to creative arrangements and the warmth that comes from a home filled with love. The twin babies Emma had mentioned were sleeping in cribs that their father had built by hand, and their older sister, about Emma's age, showed Marcus a corner where she had set up a library of books she shared with other children in the building. Each apartment told a similar story of lives lived with intention and community connections that extended far beyond the building's walls. Residents knew each other's birthdays, medical conditions, work schedules, and family histories. They shared meals during holidays, looked after each other's children, and provided the kind of informal support network that social services departments struggled to replicate through official programs. This isn't just housing, Marcus realized as they climbed back to Mei Lin's apartment on the second floor. This is an ecosystem. "Now you begin to understand," Mei Lin said, settling into her recliner by the window. "Buildings can be replaced, but communities take decades to grow. What you see here cannot be rebuilt somewhere else, because it exists in the connections between people, not in the walls that surround them." Emma climbed onto her grandmother's lap, fitting perfectly in the space that seemed designed specifically for her. "Tell him about Grandpa's garden," she said, pointing toward the window that overlooked the small backyard. Mei Lin's eyes took on a distant quality as she began to speak about her late husband, who had died 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. David was not a man who spoke many words, but he could make anything grow. "When we first moved here, the backyard was nothing but weeds and broken concrete. Every spring, he would add something new. Tomatoes the first year, then roses, then herbs for cooking. By the time Emma was born, we had created a small paradise." She pointed to different sections of the garden, visible through the window. "Those are his peonies, the ones that bloom every June like clockwork. The apple tree he planted when Emma was 2, so she would have fresh fruit when she got older. The herb garden, where I still collect ingredients for the soups I make when neighbors are sick. Marcus found himself looking at the garden with new appreciation. What had appeared to be a simple collection of plants now revealed itself as a carefully planned ecosystem, decades in the making. The tree Emma had drawn was real, though currently bare of leaves. The flower beds she had sketched were dormant but clearly established, their borders defined by years of careful tending. After David died, I thought about selling, Malin continued. This apartment felt too big for just an old woman and a little girl. But Emma reminded me that David's spirit lives in everything he planted. Every spring when the flowers bloom, she tells me that Grandpa is saying hello. Emma nodded solemnly. The garden talks to us. It tells us when it needs water, or when the soil is happy. Grandpa taught me how to listen before he went to heaven. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of loss that he had buried for so long he had forgotten it existed. I had a grandfather who gardened, he heard himself saying. I used to help him plant vegetables behind his house in Queens. What happened to his garden? Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. It was torn down after he died, paved over for a parking lot. Emma's face crumpled with sympathy. That must have made your heart very sad. Marcus nodded, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. It did make me sad. I never really thought about it until now. Malin reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand on Marcus's arm. Grief for lost places is real grief, she said gently. It deserves to be acknowledged, not forgotten. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the afternoon light shift across the garden. Marcus found himself imagining the space in full bloom, the way it would look in spring when David's carefully planted flowers returned to life. He thought about Emma's drawing and the way she had captured not just the physical appearance of her home, but its emotional significance as well. His phone buzzed with another message from Rodriguez, but Marcus ignored it. For the first time in months, possibly years, he felt present in a moment rather than focused on the next item on his schedule. The feeling was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting, like returning to a room he had forgotten he missed. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Harrison?" Emma said, breaking the silence. "When you were little, did you ever have a place that felt like home?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I did," he said finally, "but I lost it when I was about your age. My family had to move because we couldn't afford to stay." "That's terrible," Emma said, her eyes wide with understanding. "Did you ever find another place that felt like home?" The question pierced through layers of professional success and financial security to reach a truth Marcus had been avoiding for decades. "No," he admitted. "I never did." Emma slipped off her grandmother's lap and approached Marcus's chair. "Would you like to see my room?" she asked. "It might help you remember what home feels like." Marcus followed Emma down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom that faced the building's rear courtyard. The room was tiny by luxury housing standards, but Emma had arranged her belongings with the kind of intentionality that made every square foot count. Her bed was pushed against one wall, beneath a window that provided a perfect view of the garden. The opposite wall held shelves displaying books, art supplies, and a collection of stuffed animals that appeared to have been carefully curated over years. What struck Marcus most was the sense of permanence in the room's arrangement. Emma's possessions weren't just stored there, they belonged there. The desk where she did homework was positioned to catch morning light. Her bookshelf was organized by both size and subject matter, suggesting someone who planned to expand her collection over time. On the windowsill, small potted plants were arranged in a row, each one labeled with Emma's careful handwriting. "I take care of the inside plants while Grandma takes care of the outside ones," Emma explained, misting a small succulent with a spray bottle. "These are my babies, and I talk to them every morning when I wake up." Marcus noticed that one of the plants was clearly struggling, its leaves yellow and drooping despite Emma's care. "That one looks sick," he said. Emma nodded sadly. That's Ferdinand. I found him at school when someone threw him in the trash because they thought he was dying. I brought him home to see if Grandma and I could help him get better. Is it working? I think so. Grandma says plants know when they're loved, even if they're too sick to show it right away. Ferdinand hasn't gotten worse since I brought him home, and yesterday I saw a tiny new leaf starting to grow. She pointed to a barely visible green shoot emerging from the plant's base. Sometimes things look dead, but they're really just waiting for the right conditions to grow again. That's what hope is, Grandma says. It's taking care of something even when you can't see results yet. Marcus stared at the plant, thinking about hope as a form of faith in invisible possibilities. In business, he had learned to make decisions based on measurable data and predictable outcomes. Hope seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford, a sentimental approach to problem-solving that led to poor financial decisions. But looking at Ferdinand's tiny new leaf, Marcus wondered if dismissing hope had cost him something essential. Emma opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out a folder filled with artwork. "Want to see more of my drawings?" she asked, settling onto her bed and patting the space beside her. Marcus sat down, noting how the mattress dipped in a way that suggested years of bedtime stories and morning snuggles. Emma spread her drawings across the bedspread, creating a gallery of her life in the building. There were pictures of holiday celebrations in the community room, sketches of neighbors helping each other with groceries, and detailed studies of the garden in different seasons. One drawing caught Marcus's attention immediately. It showed the building at night, with warm light glowing from every window and stick figures visible in each apartment. Some were cooking, others reading, one was playing music, and several were talking on phones or gathering in small groups. The overall effect suggested a hive of human activity, a place where life was being actively lived rather than simply endured. "This one shows our building as a community," Emma explained. "Each window has a different story happening, but they're all connected because we share the same home." Marcus studied the drawing's details, noting how Emma had captured the interdependence between residents. The figure representing Mrs. Patterson was accepting a meal from the figure representing Malin. The musician was playing for an audience gathered in the hallway. Children were moving between apartments as if the entire building was their extended family's home. "What would happen to this community if the building were demolished?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Emma's expression grew serious. "It would disappear forever. The city found new apartments for everyone, but they're all in different neighborhoods. Mrs. Patterson is going to a place for old people, where she won't be allowed to have her cat. The Ramirez family is moving in with relatives across town. Mr. Delacroix found a room in someone's house, but he's not allowed to practice trumpet there." She pointed to each window in her drawing as she spoke, her voice growing smaller with each detail. "Everyone is going to different places where they don't know anybody and nobody knows them. They'll be safe and have roofs over their heads, but they won't have each other anymore." The weight of this reality settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. He had viewed the relocation assistance provided to residents as generous, even compassionate by industry standards. Finding alternative housing for displaced residents was expensive, and not legally required beyond the minimum notice period. But Emma's description revealed the limitation of thinking about housing as merely shelter rather than as the foundation for human connection. "What about you and your grandmother?" he asked. "The apartment the city found for you, is it really as bad as you described?" Emma nodded, pulling another drawing from her folder. This one showed a tall, impersonal building with small square windows arranged in perfect rows. The apartment she had drawn inside was a single room with a kitchenette in one corner and barely enough space for 2 beds. There was no garden, no community spaces, and no neighbors visible in the other windows. "It's not really bad," Emma said carefully, as if trying to be fair. "It's just not home. There's no place for Ferdinand and my other plants. There's no room for Grandma's recliner by the window. The bathroom is down the hall, and Grandma's legs hurt when she has to walk too far." She set the drawing aside and looked at Marcus with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "I think the people who found that place for us were trying to help, but they don't understand the difference between having a place to live and having a home." Marcus felt the distinction settle into his understanding with uncomfortable clarity. In his professional life, he measured success in terms of square footage, price per unit, and return on investment. The emotional value of place, the intangible benefits of community, and the psychological impact of displacement were externalities that didn't appear in profit and loss statements. But Emma's drawings made these invisible costs visible in a way that was impossible to ignore. His phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout their conversation, but Marcus had been ignoring the messages. Now, as afternoon light began to fade through Emma's bedroom window, he realized that his delay in authorizing demolition was creating complications that would require explanation. Project timelines existed for good reasons, and construction crews couldn't be kept idle indefinitely while he wrestled with philosophical questions about the nature of home. "I need to make some phone calls," he told Emma, standing up from her bed. "Thank you for showing me your room and your drawings. They've helped me understand things I hadn't considered before." Emma scrambled to her feet and followed him toward the hallway. "Are you going to save our house?" she asked, her voice carrying both hope and fear of disappointment. Marcus paused, struck by the weight of her question and his own uncertainty about how to answer it. "I'm going to try to figure out if there's a way to solve everyone's problems," he said carefully. "Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be, and maybe there's a solution that works better for everyone." Emma nodded as if this answer made perfect sense. "Grandma says the best solutions are the ones where everybody wins something important, even if they have to give up something too." As Marcus walked back through the building toward the street, he carried Emma's words with him, along with the weight of decisions that would affect not just his financial bottom line, but the lives of people who had shared their stories with him. The hallways that had seemed narrow and dated during his initial property assessments now felt intimate rather than cramped. The worn spots on the stairs spoke of generations of residents climbing toward their homes, and the sounds of life he could hear through apartment doors suggested vitality rather than decay. Outside, Rodriguez was waiting by the construction fence with an expression that managed to convey both professional patience and personal concern. The crew had used their extended break to organize equipment and review safety protocols, but they were clearly ready to either proceed with demolition or pack up for the day. "How do you want to handle this, boss?" Rodriguez asked as Marcus approached. Marcus looked back at the building, noting how the late afternoon light made its windows glow like Emma had drawn them in her nighttime community picture. "I need to make some calls and think through options," he said. "Can you send the crew home for the day? We'll resume tomorrow after I've had time to work through some complications." Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested questions he was too professional to ask. "You want me to reschedule the inspectors and the debris removal crews?" "Hold off on rescheduling anything until tomorrow afternoon," Marcus replied. "I may have a different approach by then." As the construction crew packed up their equipment and loaded the heavy machinery back onto transport trucks, Marcus sat in his car making the series of phone calls that would determine whether Emma's drawing had the power to change more than just his perspective. The first call went to his lead architect, the second to the city planning department, and the third to his own heart, which had been silent for so long he had forgotten it still knew how to speak. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out."